At 27, I, Patricia, sit at the end of a mahogany table as my sister brands me a criminal in front of 40 guests. We talk so much about integrity, father, yet we ignore the thief sitting at the end of our own table. Clara announces, her emerald gown shimmering under the crystal chandelier. She claims I robbed our mother's ostrich Birkin, while the room freezes in a brittle, 72-degree silence. I do not flinch or offer a single tear. I merely set my silver fork against the bone china with clinical precision. Paid in truth. How I dismantled their legacy using the silence they forced upon me is what happened next. The Greenwich estate operated on a clockwork of perceived perfection, where a person's value was measured by the frequency of their name in the Sunday social columns. My father, Harrison Vance, presided over the mahogany desk in his study, with the rigid posture of a man who believed legacy was a birthright rather than an achievement. I remember the weight of the silence when I presented him with my acceptance letter to Oxford's biochemistry program. He didn't look up from the ledger where he was tallying the interest on Clara's latest equestrian venture. He merely tapped his gold Mont Blanc pen against the blotter. 3 sharp clicks that signaled my presence was an interruption to the family business. Clara was the sun around which the Vance universe orbited, her laughter echoing through the foyer while I studied by the dim light of a desk lamp I'd bought myself. At 18, I didn't know that the $240,000 meant for my future was already being liquidated to silence Clara's debts. My mother, Beatrice, was the architect of our invisibility, treating social scandal with the same clinical detachment a surgeon treats a localized infection. She spent afternoons in the solarium, surrounded by $600 orchids that received more direct eye contact than I did in a calendar year. During the annual Vance Foundation galas, my designated seat was always at table 14, positioned precisely 42 feet from the podium and obscured by a marble pillar near the service entrance. From that vantage point, I watched Beatrice adjust Clara's Cartier bracelet so the diamonds caught the light for photographers. While my achievements in research were dismissed as a quaint hobby, I was the ghost in the machine, expected to provide the labor of excellence without reward. Every dinner was a choreographed performance where my role was to remain silent, dressed in neutral tones that blended into the wallpaper, while Clara's demands dictated the family's financial budget. Beatrice's smile never reached her eyes when she looked at me, a distance maintained to ensure I never felt entitled to warmth. In the library's corner, seated in a wing chair smelling of lavender, was Grandma Eleanor. She was the family's silent matriarch, a woman who mastered being present without being perceived. While my parents doted on Clara, Eleanor watched the room with the precision of a high-definition security feed. She noticed when I began skipping meals to save money for textbooks, and she saw the way Clara's hands shook when she thought no one was looking. Eleanor didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, she gave me a leather-bound notebook and told me to record every transaction, every slight, and every date. She understood that power isn't found in a loud voice, but in the accumulation of undeniable facts. While Clara spent $15,000 on a single weekend, Eleanor taught me to read a balance sheet, her eyes sharp behind spectacles. She was building a structure of truth years before I knew I was being robbed. She used my invisibility as a cloak to prepare me for the day when the silence would finally be broken. August 14, 2015, remains etched in my mind with the cold clarity of a forensic report. It was 4:12 p.m. when I walked into my father's study, the scent of expensive cedar and Davidoff tobacco clinging to the heavy velvet curtains. I had come to collect the wire transfer confirmation for my Oxford tuition, a sum of $240,000 meticulously saved since my grandfather's passing. Instead, I found Harrison staring at a spreadsheet that didn't include my name. The light from the green-shaded lamp cast long, distorted shadows across his face as he adjusted his gold cufflinks with agonizing slowness. He didn't offer a chair. He simply slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany desk, a liquidation notice for the education trust. My future, calculated in ink and decimal points, had been redirected. The ledger showed 3 separate transfers to a holding company in Macau, all dated within the last 48 hours, matching the timeline of Clara's unfortunate weekend in Monte Carlo. A family survives by its strongest pillars, Patricia, not by its ambitions, my father said, his voice as steady as if he were discussing a minor change in the quarterly projections. He finally looked up, his eyes devoid of the fatherly warmth he reserved for Clara's social triumphs. He explained, with a chillingly logical cadence, that Clara's gambling debts threatened the Vance reputation, and the tuition fund was the only liquid asset available to silence the creditors before the morning papers hit the stands. I stood perfectly still, my hands at my sides, noting the way the sunlight hit a stray dust mote dancing between us. I didn't scream. and I didn't beg him to reconsider the 9 years of academic labor I had invested to earn that placement. I asked if he understood that he was stealing my life to buy Clara's silence. He didn't answer. He merely picked up his Montblanc pen and began signing a stack of unrelated documents, dismissing me with a flick of the wrist. That evening, I walked out of the Greenwich estate with one scuffed leather suitcase and precisely $84.12 in my pocket. I didn't look back at the illuminated windows or the manicured lawn that felt like a velvet cage. The Connecticut humidity hung heavy, but my mind was a sharp blade of resolve. I took the 9:45 p.m. bus to Port Authority, the engine's vibration a mechanical lullaby for the person I was. What I didn't realize then was that my father hadn't just stolen my tuition. He had handed me total liberation. By stripping away my inheritance, he removed my obligation to the Vance name. As the Manhattan skyline emerged like a jagged diamond, I made a silent promise. I would build an empire from the silence they forced upon me, and one day, they would be the ones begging for a seat at my table. Manhattan in 2016 felt like a series of cold metal surfaces and the persistent hum of industrial refrigeration. I lived in a 400-square-foot studio in Long Island City, where the rent was exactly $1,840, leaving me with a weekly food budget of $42. I remember the exact texture of the generic protein bars I ate for dinner while sitting on a plastic crate, staring at a second-hand centrifuge I had salvaged from a university liquidation sale. My hands were often stained with the faint, metallic scent of reagent chemicals, a smell that replaced the expensive Jo Malone candles of my mother's solarium. I didn't call home, and I didn't check the social registers to see which gala Clara was attending in a $4,000 gown. Instead, I focused on the microscopic movements of cellular structures under a cracked lens, documenting every failure with the same clinical detachment my father used to dismiss my future. Silence wasn't a void. It was a workshop. By the spring of 2019, my research into synthetic insulin precursors had generated 3 patents that the industry veterans ignored because I lacked the Vance pedigree on my resume. I worked 16-hour shifts at a diagnostic lab in Brooklyn, earning $24.50 an hour, while my peers from Oxford were finishing their doctorates on family stipends. I remember the weight of the rejection letters, 42 in total, each one a reminder that the world preferred a famous name over a functional breakthrough. I didn't crumble during those nights when the heat in my apartment failed and the temperature dropped to 54 degrees. I simply wrapped myself in a threadbare wool blanket and recalculated my chemical yields on a battered laptop. Success was a matter of titration, a slow addition of effort until the solution finally changed color. I was becoming a ghost in the pharmaceutical supply chain, a shadow that moved with the precision of a scalpel, invisible yet essential. It was on my 27th birthday that a courier delivered a thick manila envelope from a law firm my family hadn't used in decades. Inside was a letter from Grandma Eleanor, written on her heavy cream stationery, containing a single key to a safe deposit box at a private bank on Fifth Avenue. She hadn't sent money. She had sent a dormant research trust established by my great-aunt, which held a specific set of distribution licenses worth approximately $300,000. Eleanor's note was brief, stating that a bridge is only useful when you have somewhere to go, not just something to flee. I realized then that while my parents were busy curating Clara's public image, Eleanor had been quietly insulating my professional trajectory with the foresight of a chess master. That $300,000 became the seed for Vespera Biotech, the company I founded under a series of interlocking holding corporations to ensure the Vance name never touched my ledger. By 2022, Vespera moved into a minimalist loft in Tribeca, a space characterized by white oak floors and a $22,000 air filtration system that hummed at a barely audible 30 decibels. My staff of 12 researchers knew me only as the woman who arrived at 6:15 a.m. and left after the cleaning crew finished their rounds at 10 p.m. We were processing contracts worth $7 million annually, primarily providing raw pharmaceutical components to mid-sized manufacturers who were struggling with supply chain disruptions. I wore charcoal gray suits that cost more than my first year's rent, but I never felt the need to post a single photo to the social media accounts my sister used to broadcast her hollow triumphs. I was building a reality that didn't require validation, a structure of power that existed entirely on balance sheets and patent filings. The silence that once felt like a punishment had become my most formidable weapon, allowing me to move undetected through the industry's highest tiers. The irony solidified in late 2024, when Vance Pharmaceuticals, my father's legacy, began defaulting on its primary supply contracts due to mismanagement and the hidden cost of Clara's mounting legal fees. Through an anonymous intermediary, Vespera Biotech became the majority supplier of the active ingredients Harrison needed to keep his production lines running. Every month, he authorized a wire transfer of $1,200,000 to a company he believed was owned by a German conglomerate, never suspecting that the funds were fueling the very life he tried to extinguish. I reviewed his quarterly reports with a cold, professional eye, noting the 24% drop in his liquidity and the desperate tone of his emails to my proxies. He was paying for my Tribeca loft, my lab equipment, and my eventual return to Greenwich, one invoice at a time. He thought he was saving his company. I knew he was merely leasing the rope that would eventually tighten around his neck. When the invitation to my parents' 40th anniversary dinner arrived, it wasn't a request for reconciliation, but a summons to witness another performance of Vance superiority. I spent $3,400 on a silk dress in a shade of midnight blue that bordered on black, a color chosen for its ability to absorb light rather than reflect it. I knew Beatrice would expect me to look defeated, a cautionary tale of what happens when a daughter chooses independence over obedience. What she didn't know was that I had spent the last 9 years documenting every embezzlement, every fraudulent transfer, and every redirected trust fund with Eleanor's guidance. The $5,000 Clara planned to accuse me of stealing was a drop of ink in an ocean of professional evidence I carried on an encrypted drive in my clutch. As I stepped into the black car at 5:45 p.m., I didn't feel anger. I felt the calm of a mathematician who had already solved the final equation. The dining room at the Greenwich estate was calibrated to a precise 72 degrees, yet the air felt 30 degrees colder as I took my seat at the far end of the table, 32 feet away from my father's chair. The 40 guests were a sea of charcoal wool and navy silk, their conversations a choreographed hum that masked the underlying tension of a family built on curated secrets. I counted 42 white calla lilies arranged in a baccarat vase, their scent thick and cloying like the perfume my mother had worn for 3 decades. My place setting was perfect, the silver polished to a mirror finish that reflected my own clinical detachment. I noticed the way the candlelight flickered against the heavy velvet curtains, casting shadows that looked like bars across the mahogany floor. I wasn't there as a daughter. I was there as a necessary witness to the Vance illusion, a ghost invited to dinner to ensure the seating chart remained symmetrical and the social registry remained unblemished. Clara sat directly opposite the guest of honor, her $8,000 Emerald Oscar de la Renta gown shimmering with a frantic energy that the others mistook for celebration. She kept adjusting the heavy gold Cartier Panther on her wrist, a rhythmic clicking that told me her internal pressure was reaching a critical threshold. Every 3 minutes, she would glance toward my mother's ostrich Birkin bag, which rested on the sideboard like a sacrificial altar. I watched the way her pupils dilated under the harsh light of the crystal chandelier, a physiological tell she had never learned to mask. She was the golden child whose luster had been bought with my stolen tuition, a puppet whose strings were fraying in the wind of her own mounting debts. To the room, she was the height of elegance, but to my calibrated eyes, she was a structural failure waiting for a catalyst to collapse the entire facade into a heap of expensive fabric and cheap lies. My father, Harrison, stood at the head of the table, his posture as rigid as the corporate bylaws he used to stifle any form of dissent within the family. He didn't look at me once during his opening remarks about legacy and the 40 years of unwavering integrity that had built the Vance pharmaceutical name. He adjusted his silk tie with a hand that showed the faintest tremor of age, a detail I noted for my future negotiations. To his left, Beatrice smoothed the lace tablecloth with a diamond-encrusted finger, her silence a tactical weapon she used to maintain the hierarchy of our domestic life. They were a portrait of stability, 2 architects of a social empire who believed that as long as the optics remained favorable, the reality beneath didn't matter. They were celebrating a union that was held together by the glue of shared scandals and the mutual agreement to sacrifice their less profitable child at the altar of public perception. The transition happened at exactly 8:14 p.m., just as the servers were clearing the second course of lobster bisque. The sound of 40 spoons hitting porcelain created a rhythmic percussion that underscored the rising tension in the room. I felt the weight of the silence I had worn like armor for 9 years, beginning to transform into something heavy and restrictive, a velvet shroud that threatened to choke my resolve. I had spent nearly a decade building an empire in the shadows, paying for their lifestyle through anonymous supply contracts while they treated me like a regrettable accounting error. I watched the steam rise from the empty bowls, noting the exact humidity in the room and the way the light hit the vintage 2012 Krug in my glass. I was done being the silent observer of my own erasure, a realization that pulsed in my veins with the cold, steady rhythm of a high-powered laboratory pump preparing for a final extraction. Clara didn't wait for the dessert course. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood with a screech that silenced the room in 3.2 seconds. She didn't look at our parents. She looked directly at me, her eyes bright with a desperation that bordered on the psychotic. She held a silver teaspoon in her right hand, tapping it against her crystal glass with a frantic cadence that signaled the end of the choreographed performance. We talk so much about integrity, Father, yet we ignore the thief sitting at the end of our own table, she announced, her voice pitched for maximum theatrical impact. The 40 guests froze, their forks suspended in midair like a frame-by-frame analysis of a social disaster. I didn't move a muscle, my face a mask of clinical neutrality that I had perfected during 1,000-hour research marathons. I simply waited for the specific lie she had spent 3 days carefully constructing to satisfy her own internal narrative. The accusation was delivered with a precision that Clara usually reserved for manipulating her trust fund distributions. She claimed that while the family was busy preparing for the gala, she had witnessed me taking exactly $5,000 in cash from our mother's limited edition ostrich Birkin bag in the solarium. She even provided a timestamp, 4:45 p.m., a detail meant to give her fabrication the weight of undeniable truth. My mother, Beatrice, didn't gasp. She simply closed her eyes for a heartbeat of exactly 2 seconds, a gesture of profound disappointment that was directed entirely at me. The room's temperature seemed to drop as the guests began to murmur, the sound of their collective judgment, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the floorboards. Clara pointed her finger at my midnight blue dress, claiming the fabric was bought with the very money I had stolen from the woman who gave me life. It was a masterpiece of projection, a final act of desperation from a crumbling icon. I felt the silence in the room begin to solidify, no longer a shield, but a thick, suffocating liquid that filled my lungs and pressed against my eardrums. For 9 years, I had used this quiet to build, to plan, and to endure the slow erosion of my dignity. But at that moment, the cost of my restraint became too high to calculate. I looked at the 40 faces turned toward me, their expressions a mix of pity and practiced disgust, and I realized that they weren't seeing a thief. They were seeing the person they had been told to hate. My father leaned forward, his hands flat on the mahogany, the $20,000 Patek Philippe on his wrist catching the light like a predator's eye. He didn't ask for my side of the story. He simply stated that the Vance name could not survive a daughter who robbed her own mother. The injustice was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that demanded a release I had been holding back for 3,200 days. Beatrice finally spoke, her voice a cool, detached monotone that was more devastating than a scream. She said that she had noticed the missing funds earlier that afternoon, but had hoped to resolve the matter privately to avoid the spectacle I seemed determined to create. By siding with Clara's lie, she was effectively sealing my exile from the only world I had ever known, choosing the preservation of a false image over the life of her own child. I watched the way she adjusted her pearls, a habit she had when she was performing a particularly difficult social surgery. She was cutting me out of the family history with the clinical efficiency of a pathologist, her eyes never once meeting mine. I realized then that my presence at this table was a strategic error I would never repeat. The air in the room felt ionized, charged with the static of a storm that was about to break the century-long drought of truth in the Vance household. Something shifted inside me then, a chemical transition from carbon to diamond under the extreme pressure of their combined betrayal. I wasn't the 18-year-old girl who had walked out of this house with $84. I was the architect of their survival, the woman who owned the very ingredients in the medicine my father took every morning. The suffocation turned into a cold, sharpening clarity, a realization that the silence was no longer my prison. It was my launching pad. I looked at Clara, who was now weeping crocodile tears into a silk handkerchief, her performance reaching its peak as she leaned into my mother's shoulder for support. They were all so convinced of their own power, so blinded by the hierarchy they had built, that they couldn't see the wolf sitting at the end of their table. I stood up slowly, my movements measured and precise, the sound of my chair sliding back the only noise in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. I didn't defend myself with words, because I knew that in this house, words were merely currency, used to buy temporary alliances. Instead, I looked toward the shadows of the library door, where Grandma Eleanor had been sitting in her wing chair, her iPad glowing with a soft, blue light that the others had ignored. She caught my eye for exactly 3 seconds, a silent confirmation of the plan we had set in motion 4 months prior, when Clara's debts first exceeded the family's liquidity. Eleanor reached out and tapped a single icon on the screen, her movements as deliberate as a grandmaster making the final move in a championship match. Above the fireplace, the 100-inch hidden projection screen began to descend with a mechanical whir that sounded like the ticking of a countdown clock. At precisely 8:22 p.m., the room went dark as the first frame of high-definition security footage flickered to life, revealing a truth that no one in that room was prepared to survive. The high-definition screen illuminated the darkened dining room at precisely 8:23 p.m., casting a sterile, blue light across 40 faces that had spent the last hour meticulously judging my character. The footage wasn't a grainy surveillance feed. It was a crystal-clear digital record of the solarium at 4:45 p.m., exactly as Clara had specified in her fabricated testimony. On the screen, the ostrich Birkin bag sat unattended on a wicker table, its pale leather glowing under the afternoon sun. Then, a hand entered the frame, but it wasn't the steady, laboratory-trained hand of a biotech director. It was a hand with a frantic, rhythmic tremor, wearing a diamond-encrusted Cartier Panther bracelet that caught the light with every nervous twitch. We watched in a silence so absolute that I could hear the mechanical hum of the projector's cooling fan. Clara appeared on screen, her eyes darting toward the hallway as she expertly navigated the bag's clasp, removing 50 crisp $100 bills with the practiced ease of a serial offender. The room's collective breath hitched as the footage transitioned into a seamless montage of the last 6 months, a chronological history of the Vance family's internal erosion. We saw Clara at a high-end pawn shop on 47th Street at 11:12 a.m. on 3 separate Tuesdays, sliding Grandma Eleanor's heirloom pearls across a scarred velvet counter in exchange for stacks of cash. We saw her in the back of a black car, frantically counting $22,000, while her pupils remained dilated to the size of quarters. My father, Harrison, didn't move. He sat frozen at the head of the table, his Patek Philippe watch ticking away the seconds of his daughter's carefully curated reputation. The internal logic that had governed his life, that Clara was the asset and I was the liability, was being dismantled by a series of time-stamped files. He looked at the screen not with the horror of a father, but with the cold realization of a CEO who had backed the wrong venture. By 8:28 p.m., the projection shifted from security footage to a series of encrypted financial ledgers provided by Grandma Eleanor's private legal counsel. The guests watched as a spreadsheet detailed 42 unauthorized transfers from the Vance Foundation's secondary accounts to a holding company in Macau, totaling $1,800,000. Every transaction was linked to Clara's digital signature. Dated precisely during the weekends Harrison had claimed she was volunteering for various charitable boards. The aroma of the uneaten lobster bisque grew heavy in the air, a cloying reminder of the luxury built on a foundation of systemic theft. Beatrice, my mother, reached for her silk napkin with a hand that finally began to tremble, her gaze fixed on the mahogany table as the social register she lived by dissolved into a public record of fraud. The social hierarchy of Greenwich wasn't just being challenged, it was being liquidated in front of the very people whose opinions Beatrice feared most. Then came the final shift, the one that would ensure the Vance legacy remained under my control whether they wanted it or not. The screen displayed the corporate structure of Vespera Biotech, the German conglomerate that had been subsidizing Harrison's failing production lines for the last 24 months. I watched my father's face as the logo of the majority supplier dissolved to reveal my own signature as the sole proprietor and chief executive. The $1,200,000 he authorized every 30 days was being paid to the daughter he had stripped of a future 9 years ago. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His jaw tightened as he looked at me, seeing the predator he had unintentionally raised. He wasn't looking at a thief anymore. He was looking at his landlord. The silence in the room was now a vacuum, pulling the oxygen out of the air as the power dynamic flipped with clinical, mathematical finality. I stood up slowly at 8:31 p.m., the sound of my silk dress whispering against the chair being the only audible movement in the entire estate. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't offer a single word of the vindication that the guests were surely expecting me to revel in. Instead, I looked at my father, noting the exact angle of his slumped shoulders and the way the light reflected off the sweat on his forehead. The supply chain for Vance Pharmaceuticals is currently being audited, Father, I said, my voice maintaining the steady, neutral cadence of a board meeting. I explained that as of 9 a.m. on Monday, the credit line for his primary raw materials would be frozen, pending a full forensic investigation into the family's redirected assets. I wasn't there for an apology or a tearful reconciliation. I was there to announce the terms of their survival. My sister's weeping was merely background noise to the sound of an empire being reclaimed. Grandma Eleanor tapped her iPad once more, and the room's lights returned to their full, unforgiving brightness, exposing the wreckage of the anniversary dinner. Clara was slumped in her chair, her $8,000 gown looking like a cheap costume under the glare of the truth we had projected. Beatrice remained immobile, a porcelain statue of a woman whose world had just been declared insolvent by her own child. I noticed a single drop of wine on the white lace tablecloth, a small, dark blemish that seemed more significant than any of the people sitting around it. The 40 guests were already looking toward the exits, their loyalties shifting in real time as they calculated the value of being associated with the new majority shareholder of the Vance name. I had spent 3,285 days preparing for this specific silence, and now that it was here, it tasted like the sterile, filtered air of a high-security laboratory. Justice, I realized then, wasn't a feeling of warmth or a sudden rush of adrenaline. It was simply the restoration of a correct balance sheet. I looked at the 2012 Krug in my glass and decided not to drink it, as the celebration was over before it had even truly begun. My father tried to speak, his mouth opening to perhaps offer a compromise or a justification, but I simply held up a hand to stop the sound before it could form. There was nothing left to negotiate because I already owned the room, the house and the future of every person sitting at the table. I had fulfilled the promise I made on that bus to Port Authority, building a fortress out of the stones they had thrown at me. The bridge to my past wasn't just burning, it was being professionally dismantled for scrap. I turned away from the table, my footsteps measured and even, leaving behind a family that had finally learned the true cost of silence. The black car pulled away from the Greenwich estate at precisely 11:42 p.m., the gravel crunching beneath the tires with a rhythmic finality that echoed the ticking of a countdown clock. I sat in the rear seat, the temperature set to a constant 68 degrees, watching the illuminated windows of my childhood home recede into the Connecticut mist. Inside those walls, the air was likely still heavy with the scent of 42 calla lilies and the metallic tang of social annihilation. I didn't look back to see if my father was standing at the mahogany door or if my mother had finally moved from her position at the dining table. My hands, resting on my charcoal silk lap, were perfectly still, showing none of the tremors that Clara had exhibited during her public collapse. I checked my phone. The first notification from a primary socialite contact had arrived at 11:45 p.m., a 3-word message that simply asked for the full security footage. By 2:15 a.m., the digital fallout of the anniversary dinner had bypassed the family's traditional PR firewall and was spreading through the tight-knit circles of the Greenwich elite like a localized contagion. I sat in my Tribeca loft, the 30-decibel hum of the air filtration system providing a sterile soundtrack to the dissolution of the Vance reputation. My inbox was a chronological record of shifting loyalties, with 24 separate inquiries from board members who were suddenly eager to discuss restructuring the pharmaceutical division. I reviewed each message with a clinical eye, noting the exact time each person realized that the power had migrated from the estate to the loft. There was no anger in my processing of these communications, only the detached observation of a biological system responding to a new, dominant apex predator. The bridge was not just burning. The very architecture of the crossing was being reevaluated for its structural integrity in a post-Vance landscape. The following Monday at 9:02 a.m., the forensic audit of Vance Pharmaceuticals commenced, a process that cost $450 per hour for each of the 6 investigators. I watched the remote data feed from my office, seeing the red flags bloom across the spreadsheets like a chemical reaction in a petri dish. My father, Harrison, attempted to call my private line 14 times between 10:01 a.m. and noon. Each attempt met with a polite, automated redirection to my legal counsel. He was no longer the patriarch issuing directives from a mahogany desk. He was a minority shareholder facing a liquidity crisis of his own making. The $1,200,000 I had been funneling into his company was now the very lever I used to pry the remaining assets from his trembling hands. Every document they uncovered, from the redirected tuition funds to the Macau transfers, was another data point in a terminal diagnosis. Clara's social exile was completed with the surgical precision of a high-tier branding agency. By Wednesday of the first week, her Instagram account, which once boasted 1,200,000 followers, was a digital ghost town of deleted posts and blocked comments. The $4,000 gowns and the Cartier bracelets were no longer symbols of status, but evidence of systemic theft that the 47th Street pawn shops were now documenting for the authorities. I received a frantic handwritten note from her at 4:30 p.m. on Thursday, delivered by a courier who looked distinctly uncomfortable on my Tribeca doorstep. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for $100,000 to Settle some private matters before the court dates were set. I didn't reply. I simply scanned the note, added it to the digital file labeled Clara Liabilities, and returned to my analysis of the third quarter synthetic insulin yields. My mother, Beatrice, retreated to the solarium, surrounded by her $600 orchids that were now the only living things in the house that didn't judge her. She canceled her standing lunch at Le Belle Bouquet for the first time in 22 years, a social death that carried more weight in her world than a legal indictment. I saw a photo of her in a tabloid on Friday, taken through a long lens at a distance of approximately 60 yards. She looked smaller, the light hitting the hollows of her cheeks with an unforgiving clarity. She had spent a lifetime curating a facade of perfection, only to have the foundation dismantled by the daughter she had deemed invisible. There were no phone calls from her, no letters, only a profound, echoing silence that I recognized as the exact frequency of the isolation she had once imposed on me. We were finally speaking the same language. The first formal meeting between Vespera Biotech and the remnants of the Vance board took place on a Tuesday at 2 p.m. in a neutral glass-walled conference room. My father sat at the far end of the table, his $14,000 suit looking 2 sizes too large for his diminished frame. He tried to initiate the session with a paternal anecdote about family values, but I cut him off at the 12-second mark with a stack of forensic reports. I informed the board that as the majority creditor, I was initiating a debt-for-equity swap that would effectively dissolve the Vance name from the corporate charter. The temperature in the room was a constant 72 degrees, but Harrison's forehead was damp with a cold sweat that he couldn't hide from the high-definition cameras. He wasn't negotiating for his legacy anymore. He was negotiating for a pension that I had already calculated down to the last cent. Grandma Eleanor joined me for tea that Friday at 4:15 p.m., the lavender scent of her perfume a familiar anchor in the sterile environment of my Tribeca loft. She didn't offer any emotional platitudes about the family's collapse. She simply handed me a leather-bound ledger containing the original trust documents from my great-aunt. "A gardener must know when the soil has turned toxic, Patricia," she said, her voice as steady as the 60-year-old diamonds on her fingers. She had spent decades observing the rot, waiting for the precise moment when the internal pressure would force a change. She was the silent architect of this justice, the one who saw the value in the ghost before the ghost became the machine. We sat in the fading sunlight for exactly 45 minutes, discussing the future of the Research Foundation, without once mentioning the names of those who had tried to bury us. By the second month, the legal proceedings against Clara for the Macau embezzlements had reached the discovery phase, revealing a total of $1,842,000 in fraudulent transfers. She was facing a potential sentence of 4 to 6 years, a reality that the Greenwich social circle discussed over martinis with a morbid or detached curiosity. I watched the news reports on a silent monitor in my lab, the captions scrolling past as I titrated a new batch of reagents. She had become a cautionary tale of the golden child who burned through the very gold that was supposed to sustain her. I didn't feel a rush of satisfaction at her plight, only the quiet, professional relief of seeing a structural error being corrected by the legal system. She was no longer a sister. She was a case file that was nearing its inevitable and mathematically certain conclusion. Harrison's health began to decline in a way that was as predictable as a declining stock chart, his blood pressure readings becoming a frequent topic of conversation for his remaining assistants. He sent me a formal request for a meeting at the Greenwich estate, citing matters of the heart that he wished to resolve before his next cardiac appointment. I agreed to a 20-minute video call instead, scheduled for a Thursday at 3:30 p.m., the time strictly monitored by my executive assistant. When his face appeared on the screen, the resolution was high enough to see the broken capillaries around his nose and the way his hands shook as he adjusted his tie. He spoke for 3 minutes about his regrets, but his eyes kept darting to the financial documents visible on his desk. I told him that my terms for his retirement remained non-negotiable, and that his legacy would now be managed by my board. Beatrice finally sent a letter on her heavy cream stationery, the ink showing the faintest smudge as if a single tear had dropped before she finished. She wrote about the nights she spent in the nursery when I was a child, a narrative of maternal devotion that I had no memory of ever actually experiencing. She was attempting to rewrite the past to secure a future that didn't involve her sitting alone in a $14 million house that she could no longer afford to heat. I read the 3 pages with the same detachment I used for a flawed research proposal, noting the logical inconsistencies and the emotional manipulation. I responded with a single-page document outlining the monthly allowance I would provide for her care, contingent on her permanent relocation to a smaller property in Florida. I wasn't being cruel. I was being practical. ensuring she had a comfortable seat for the final act of her own performance. The liquidation of the Greenwich estate was finalized on a rainy Tuesday in October, the house selling for exactly $14,800,000 to an anonymous buyer. I watched the movers carry out the crystal chandelier and the mahogany table, the objects that had once defined the boundaries of my world being packed into cardboard boxes. I didn't bid on any of the family heirlooms, not even the silver spoons that had been used to serve the soup on the night of my final humiliation. The only thing I kept was the small, leather-bound notebook Grandma Eleanor had given me, the one filled with the early records of my father's original betrayals. The estate was now just a series of rooms filled with the echoes of a family that had forgotten how to be human. I stood on the sidewalk for 5 minutes, the rain cold against my face, and then I turned toward my car. Vespera Biotech's acquisition of Vance Pharmaceuticals was announced on the cover of Biotech Weekly in November, the headline focusing on the unprecedented hostile takeover by a daughter. I was photographed in the lobby of our new headquarters, wearing a charcoal gray suit and a look of clinical focus that the interviewer described as chillingly efficient. They didn't know about the bus to Port Authority or the $84 in my pocket. They only saw the results of a 9-year titration process. I had transformed the Vance name into a footnote in the history of Vespera, a subsidiary that existed solely to produce the ingredients for my own innovations. The industry saw me as a visionary, but I knew I was just a survivor who had finally learned how to build a fortress that no one could breach from the inside. The silence was now my own, a quiet space where I could work without the interference of ghosts. What I didn't realize back then, during those long nights in the Long Island City studio, was that the pain was a necessary reagent for the transformation. At this stage of my life, I can look back at the girl sitting on the plastic crate and see her not as a victim, but as a person who was busy calculating the exact weight of her own worth. Have you ever felt like you were the villain in a story you didn't even write, forced into a role that was designed to make someone else look like a hero? I see you there, in the comments of your own life, trying to figure out if the injustice you're feeling is real or just a side effect of being invisible. I need to tell you that the numbers don't lie, even when the people around you are doing nothing but projecting their own failures onto your shoulders. Your silence isn't a void. It's a workshop where you are forging the keys to your own eventual liberation. The transition from the old life to the new was marked by a series of precise financial shifts, like the movement of tectonic plates deep beneath the surface of the earth. I moved Grandma Eleanor into the penthouse of my Tribeca building, a space that offered a 32-mile view of the Hudson River and the city that had once felt so hostile. She spent her afternoons in a room filled with lavender and light, her iPad now used for monitoring her favorite charities rather than security footage of her own grandchildren. We never talked about Clara's sentencing or the way Harrison's name had been scrubbled from the philanthropic boards of Connecticut. We talked about the new research wing I was building in Brooklyn and the way the light changed over the water at sunset. She had been my secret ally, the one who held the map while I was wandering through the dark, and now we were both home. Clara's sentencing hearing took place on a cold morning in January, the courtroom filled with the hollow echoes of a social circle that had already moved on to the next scandal. She wore a simple black dress and no jewelry, her hands held tightly in her lap as the judge read through the list of 42 fraudulent transactions. The $5,000 she had accused me of stealing was mentioned as a minor detail in a broader pattern of systemic deception and financial abuse. I didn't attend the hearing. I watched the live stream from my office, the monitor casting a blue glow on the charcoal fabric of my suit. When the sentence of 5 years was handed down, she didn't scream. She just slumped forward, a golden child who had finally run out of light. I closed the laptop at 11:15 a.m. and went to a meeting about the scalability of our new synthetic protein lines. The rebranding of the company was completed in the spring, with the name Vance officially removed from all signage and corporate stationery across the entire international supply chain. I remember the exact moment the new sign was illuminated above the factory in New Jersey, the blue LEDs of the Vespera logo cutting through the evening gloom. It was a visual confirmation of the new reality I had built, a structure of power that was based on innovation rather than inheritance or the preservation of a social rank. My father's old assistants now reported to me, their voices carrying the tone of professional respect that had once been reserved only for the patriarch. I managed the transition with the same clinical detachment I used for a chemical extraction, ensuring that every piece of the old regime was either integrated or discarded based on its functional utility to the new empire. Looking back from this plateau of success, I see that justice isn't a loud, dramatic event with a cheering crowd. It's the quiet, steady sound of a door locking from the inside. Have you ever felt the weight of a family secret that was designed to crush you? only to realize that the truth is a lever you can use to lift yourself out of the dark. I see you in the silence of your own struggles, wondering if the people who hurt you will ever have to face the cold, hard numbers of their own actions. I want you to know that the payoff is coming, not as a revenge you plan, but as a reality that simply arrives, because it is the only logical conclusion. Share your story in the comments below. Tell me about the moment you realized that your invisibility was actually your greatest weapon in the war for your own future. We are building a community of ghosts who have finally decided to haunt the people who tried to make us disappear. The physical transformation of my life was mirrored in the minimalist aesthetics of my new executive suite, a space where every object had a specific purpose and a documented provenance. I replaced the heavy velvet curtains and mahogany desks of the Greenwich estate with white oak, polished steel, and floor-to-ceiling glass that allowed the city to be my only wallpaper. My wardrobe was a series of 12 identical charcoal gray suits, a decision made to eliminate the fatigue of choice and focus my mental energy on the titration of my remaining goals. I didn't own a single piece of ostrich leather or a Cartier Panther, preferring the silent, understated luxury of a high-precision timepiece and a perfectly calibrated fountain pen. I was no longer trying to blend into the wallpaper. I had become the wall itself, a solid, unyielding structure that defined the space around it for everyone else. Beatrice's relocation to the Florida property was finalized in the 3rd month, her departure from Connecticut marked by the sale of her last few pieces of high-end jewelry to cover the remaining debts. I received a final, 3-word telegram from her that simply said, "I am here," a brief acknowledgement of the new, smaller reality I had provided for her final years. I didn't send a reply. I simply noted the arrival of the message in my personal log and continued with my work on the pediatric antibiotic distribution project. She was safe, she was housed, and she was no longer in a position to sacrifice my life for her social standing, which was the only form of peace I was willing to grant her. The distance between us was now both physical and moral, a gap that could not be bridged by memories or the heavy cream stationery she still insisted on using for her infrequent notes. Harrison passed away quietly in his sleep during the 2nd year of my tenure as CEO, his death a brief headline in the business section that focused primarily on the success of the Vespera merger. I attended the funeral in a charcoal suit, standing 42 feet away from the grave as the mahogany casket was lowered into the earth. There were no tears, only a profound sense of closure that felt like the final period at the end of a very long and difficult chapter of a book. I watched the 40 guests, most of whom had been at the anniversary dinner, as they tried to find the right words to say to the woman who now held all the power they once coveted. I didn't stay for the wake. I drove straight back to the office, the sound of the engine a mechanical lullaby for a man I had finished mourning 9 years ago. The legal settlement with Clara's remaining creditors was settled for 30 cents on the dollar, a negotiation I handled through a series of anonymous proxies to ensure the Vance name never resurfaced in the headlines. She remained in the facility in Vermont, her days governed by a schedule that was as rigid as the one I had once lived by in the Greenwich estate. I provided her with a modest stipend and the best legal representation money could buy, not out of love, but out of a clinical commitment to the stability of the family's remaining assets. She was a ghost in her own life, a person who had lost everything because she believed her own lies for too long. I checked her progress reports once a quarter, noting the same lack of improvement that I would expect from a fundamentally flawed research model. She was a reminder of the cost of entitlement, a debt she would be paying for the rest of her natural life. In the 4th year, Vespera Biotech went public with a valuation of $2,400,000,000, a number that finally made the Vance name irrelevant to the industry analysts. I stood on the floor of the stock exchange, the ticker symbol VSPR, scrolling past in a bright green line that felt like a pulse of pure, digital life. I was 35 years old, and I had built an empire from the silence of my childhood, a reality that didn't require the validation of a social registry or a parent's approval. I looked at the cameras and didn't smile, my face a mask of professional calm that was recognized as the hallmark of my leadership style. I had moved beyond the need for justice or revenge. I was now simply the architect of a future that I had designed with the precision of a master builder. The girl from the bus was gone, replaced by a woman who knew exactly what it cost to be free. Grandma Eleanor passed away at the age of 94, her final breath taken in the sun-drenched penthouse while looking at the Hudson River she had grown to love. She left me everything, including the original diaries she had kept for 70 years, a record of every Vance family secret and every hidden act of love she had ever witnessed. I spent 3 nights reading through the pages, seeing my own struggle through her eyes and realizing that I had never truly been as alone as I had felt. She was the one who had kept the flame alive when the wind was trying to blow it out, and her legacy was the very foundation of my success. I didn't cry at her funeral. I celebrated her life by establishing a scholarship fund at Oxford for biochemistry students who lacked the financial means to complete their degrees. It was the only way I knew how to truly honor the woman who had taught me the power of the silent, long-term plan. The childhood bedroom I had once occupied in the Greenwich estate was converted into a home office by the new owners. The walls painted a bright, modern white that erased the shadows of my past. I saw a photo of it in an architectural magazine and felt nothing but a distant, professional curiosity about the choice of lighting fixtures and the desk placement. The dust had settled on the Vance legacy, and the new inhabitants were busy creating their own history in the space that had once been my prison. I realized then that I didn't need to burn the house down to be free of it. I just needed to move far enough away that its gravity no longer affected my orbit. The memories were now just data points, frozen in time and stripped of their emotional charge by the sheer weight of my subsequent achievements. I had reclaimed my life by building something new, not by trying to fix something that was always meant to break. The finality of the numbers is what brings me the most peace at the end of the day, the way a balanced ledger offers a truth that people simply cannot provide. I sit in my Tribeca loft, the air filtration system humming at 30 decibels, and I review the quarterly reports of the foundation I built in Grandma Eleanor's name. We have funded 42 new research projects this year alone, each one a potential breakthrough that could save thousands of lives from the diseases that my father's company once exploited. I am no longer a daughter or a sister in the traditional sense. I am the director of a system that functions with a clarity and a purpose that I once only dreamed of. The $5,000 that Clara accused me of stealing is now the exact amount I spend on office supplies every 2 weeks, a trivial detail in the vast, complex machine of my daily existence. Justice, as I have learned, isn't a destination. It's a constant state of being that you maintain through your own actions and the standards you set for yourself and others. I see you out there, watching this and wondering if the pain you're feeling right now will ever translate into the power you see on the screen. I need you to understand that the transformation is happening every time you choose to remain silent and work, instead of screaming into a void that doesn't care about your tears. Share your progress with me in the comments. Let me know what specific step you're taking today to build your own fortress out of the silence they've imposed on you. We are the architects of the next era, the ones who know that the most powerful thing you can do is to be undeniably, mathematically correct in everything you do. The noise of your enemies is just background radiation to the steady, cold light of your own inevitable success. The double temporal register of my life allows me to be in 2 places at once, the girl on the bus to Manhattan and the woman in the charcoal suit at the head of the boardroom table. I can feel the vibration of the engine and the weight of the $84 in my pocket, even as I sign a contract for a $300 million clinical trial. This duality is my strength, the reminder that everything I have built was earned through the slow, patient titration of effort and the refusal to accept the labels that were forced upon me. What I didn't know then was that the very invisibility I hated was the shield that allowed me to become the person I am today. I can see the girl in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in 30 years, I can offer her the clinical, detached smile of a person who has finally solved the final equation. The new definition of family that I have built is one based on shared values, intellectual honesty, and the mutual commitment to excellence rather than the accidents of biology or the dictates of social rank. My circle is small, consisting of Grandma Eleanor's legal team, my senior researchers, and the few peers who have earned my respect through their own clinical detachment and professional integrity. We don't have anniversary dinners with 40 guests and calla lilies. We have late-night strategy sessions with high-quality coffee and the sound of data being processed in real time. This is the life I was meant to have. A reality that is as sterile and as functional as a clean room, and as beautiful as a perfectly executed chemical synthesis. I have moved beyond the need for the warmth that Beatrice and Harrison could never provide, finding my own satisfaction in the cool, steady rhythm of a world that I control. The final image of the Vance legacy is a digital file, encrypted and stored in a secure server that only I have the keys to access. It contains the security footage from the solarium, the Macau bank records, and the handwritten notes from Clara that I never bothered to answer. It is a museum of the past, a collection of artifacts that I keep only to remind myself of the importance of the long-term plan and the power of the silent observation. I don't look at it often, as the future is far more interesting than the wreckage of a family that didn't know how to value its most capable asset. The files are there if I ever need them, the insurance policy against the return of the ghosts. But for now, they are just bits of data in a quiet corner of my digital empire. The bridge is gone, and I am standing on the other side, looking at a horizon that I own entirely. I sit by the window of my loft as the sun sets over the Hudson, the light reflecting off the crystal glass in my hand with a precision that I find deeply satisfying. The temperature is a constant 68 degrees, and the air is filtered to a level of purity that few people ever get to experience in their daily lives. I am 31, I am successful, and I am finally completely alone in a way that feels like total liberation rather than a punishment. The silence that once felt like a velvet cage is now the medium through which I move with total power and absolute clarity. My sister is a number in a prison system. My mother is a pensioner in Florida, and my father is a memory in a mahogany casket. But I am here, and I am just beginning. The titration is complete, and the solution has finally, perfectly changed its color for the very last time. The plateau of reflection is a quiet place, a space where the emotions of the past have been filtered out and replaced by the cool, steady light of a reality that I have built for myself. I look at the screen of my iPad and see the latest reports from the lab, the numbers lining up in a way that indicates a 98% success rate for our new clinical trials. I think of Grandma Eleanor and the way she used to watch the room, and I realize that I am now the one who is observing everything with a clinical and detached eye. The story of the Vance family is over, but the story of Patricia is a long-term project that is currently exceeding all of its original growth projections. I set the glass down on the white oak table, the sound a soft, final click that signals the end of the day and the beginning of a future I have earned. It is 6:15 a.m. in my Tribeca loft, the sun rising over the East River at an angle of 42 degrees. I watch the steam rise from my Jura Z10, a machine that cost exactly $3,999. Its mechanical hum, a steady 30-decibel anchor in the morning quiet. On my white oak desk lies a single-eye, framed patent, number 11th Fawthward 82903, the chemical foundation for a synthetic insulin that has effectively rendered the old Vance pharmaceutical formula obsolete. I do not look at it with pride, but with the same clinical detachment I use to review a quarterly audit. The mahogany furniture of Greenwich has been replaced by brushed steel and tempered glass, surfaces that do not hold the fingerprints of a past I chose to liquidate. My hands are steady as I pick up the ceramic mug, noting the way the heat dissipates at a predictable rate. I am no longer a daughter waiting for a seat at a table. I am the architect of the room itself. Last month, a final accounting report arrived from the Florida property, detailing the $4,200 spent on Beatrice's specialized medical care and the maintenance of her orchid garden. I approved the expenditure in 3.5 seconds, a transaction that carried no more emotional weight than a utility bill for one of my laboratory facilities. Clara's quarterly correspondence from the Vermont facility remains unopened in a digital folder, a series of bytes that represent a debt she is still paying at a rate of 24 hours a day. I do not feel the need to witness their decline, just as I no longer feel the need to justify my own ascent. The hierarchy of my childhood was a structural illusion, a curated performance that required my invisibility to function. Now, the silence is filled with the sound of data being processed and the rhythmic breathing of a life that is entirely my own design. Success is a correct balance. For those of you watching from the shadows of your own family tables, wondering if the weight of their judgment will ever stop pressing against your lungs, I have a clinical observation to share. You have been told that your silence is a sign of weakness, a void where your worth should be. But those who tell you this are usually the ones terrified of what you are building in the dark. Invisibility is not a punishment. It is a laboratory where you can titrate your resolve until it becomes as hard and as clear as industrial diamond. You do not need to scream to be heard. You just need to wait until the numbers are so overwhelming that they do the shouting for you. When you generate your own light through labor, the ghosts of your past lose their power to haunt you. Justice is a subproduct of survival, a mathematical certainty that arrives when you finally stop playing their game and start writing your own rules. I keep $84.12 in a small cheese glass encased display near my entrance, the exact amount I carried when I stepped onto that bus to Port Authority. It serves as a constant reminder that the value of a person is not found in the inheritance they are promised, but in the capacity to transform a loss into a legacy. The 2012 Krug. I refused to drink at the anniversary dinner has been replaced by a simple glass of filtered water, a substance that is essential, transparent, and entirely under my control. My life is now a series of high-precision events, a titration of time and effort that has resulted in a purity of purpose I once thought impossible. As the sun illuminates my empire, I have one final question for you. Have you ever realized that the person who tried to bury you was actually just planting the seed for the power you wield today? Tell me in the comments. What was the exact moment you realized your invisibility was your greatest weapon?